The summer air hung thick over Savannah, Georgia that evening as the last light of day bled into a soft orange haze along the old brick streets. At Magnolia Table, the kitchen was already sweltering with heat from the stoves and the nervous energy of the biggest dinner service they had ever booked. Joanna Griggs moved briskly between stations, wiping sweat from her brow with her sleeve, while barking instructions to her sous chef and line cooks. Her hair was pinned back tight, and her crisp white apron was flecked with sauce and flour. The restaurant's narrow hallway was crowded with servers shuffling past with baskets of warm bread and glass carafes of sweet tea. Every table had been reserved for weeks in advance. The town's newspaper had written a glowing feature on Joanna's seasonal menu celebrating local produce and seafood. She had every reason to feel triumphant, but a furrow of worry creased her brow that even the praise could not smooth away. Outside the kitchen, the dining room hummed with anticipation. The walls were decorated with framed photographs of Savannah squares and marshlands, and each table was set with evocative candles casting small shifting shadows. Regulars smiled at one another and speculated about what Joanna would cook that night. The waitstaff were polite, but tense trained to handle the expected rush but aware that this was make or break for the small bistro. Joanna had poured her savings into Magnolia Table over the past 3 years. Every chair and plate had been picked out by her hand. Even the old tin ceiling had been carefully restored to its vintage gleam. But despite this curated charm, a storm was gathering behind the scenes that no one in the dining room could see or hear. The customers would later remember the faint scent of basil and garlic, the flicker of candlelight on pressed white tablecloths, and nothing at all about the screams that came later. Joanna paused for a moment at the edge of the kitchen watching her team work. She felt a sharp twist in her stomach. She turned to her sous chef Ben and muttered that she needed 5 minutes of air. She pushed open the back door and stepped onto the narrow concrete alley behind the restaurant. The door swung shut behind her with a squeal of old hinges. The alley was lined with trash bins, and the sweet-sour smell of rotting produce mingled with the humidity. A few neon signs glowed further down the block, advertising bars and late-night diners. Joanna pulled out her cell phone, which was one of those chunky models with the antenna sticking out, and stared at the dark screen for a moment before thumbing through the contacts. The kitchen noise was muffled now, and she felt the sweat cooling on her skin, leaving her chilled despite the heat of the evening. The call she placed connected, and she spoke low voice, urgent but controlled. Her words were lost to the traffic rumbling in the street nearby. Witnesses would later recall seeing her leaning against the red brick wall, cupping the phone to her ear with one hand and pressing her other hand to her forehead. She sounded impatient and a little angry. Then she ended the call abruptly without saying goodbye. She remained standing there for another minute, staring into the darkness beyond the dumpsters. Her expression was unreadable. Inside the restaurant, Ben checked his watch and frowned, wondering what was taking her so long. The line cook swapped uneasy glances but continued ladling bisque and searing fish as orders came in rapid fire over the printer. Plates began to stack up waiting for her final approval, but Joanna never came back through that door. The kitchen door stayed shut for longer than anyone realized. One of the servers finally pushed outside to smoke and found no one there. They shrugged it off at first, assuming Joanna had walked to the corner store for a drink or was pacing the block to cool off. But when the first major table began demanding their entrees, the staff began to panic. Ben tried to keep things moving, improvising plating and making executive decisions Joanna never allowed anyone else to make. Tickets piled up and the small dining room began to grow restless. Glasses clinked harder. Conversations hushed as the delay stretched on. Customers shifted in their seats while waiters made awkward apologies, blaming the kitchen for being slammed. The mood soured quickly. It had been a showpiece evening. It was turning into a fiasco. Meanwhile, the back door remained open a crack, letting mosquitoes into the dish room and leaking the smell of hot garbage into the prep area. Someone finally shut it in frustration, but it was too late. Joanna was gone. She had simply vanished from the alley with no one seeing where she went. In the chaos, no one remembered the exact time she left. A busboy said 10 minutes past 8, but another insisted it was closer to 9. The receipts and order slips became confusing to audit. The entire staff was exhausted and frantic by closing time. When police finally arrived, they found an abandoned kitchen that smelled of burnt butter and disappointment. Pots sat unwashed in the sink. Herbs wilted on the counter. A lone apron lay on the floor trampled with shoe prints, but it was not hers. By the time the local detective in charge questioned them, the staff were in tears or refusing to speak out of fear for their jobs. Her husband, Mike Griggs, arrived at the restaurant well past midnight wearing khakis and a polo shirt darkened with sweat. He said he had been at home watching a ball game. His voice cracked as he asked what happened to his wife. He wandered through the kitchen, muttering to himself, touching the stove she had last stirred, and staring at the empty space where she always stood near the pass. The police were methodical but unimpressed by the scene. There was no blood, no clear sign of struggle except for the back door that had swung in the warm breeze all night, letting in bugs and the smell of rotting meat. Outside, the sky was darkening with the promise of thunder, but for now the air remained breathless and hot. The next morning, Savannah woke to news that its star chef was missing. Local news vans parked outside Magnolia Table, interviewing neighbors who shook their heads and clucked sympathetically. The city had seen crime before, but something about a woman simply evaporating from the back alley of her own restaurant unsettled people deeply. They whispered to one another in the bakery lines and at the grocery store that Joanna was too good to run away. She would never abandon her kitchen or her staff on such a big night, but the police could not find her. Bloodhounds picked up no clear trail in the alley. The nearby river was dragged with no result. Helicopters swept the marshland but turned up only old debris and the scuttling of raccoons startled by the searchlights. By the end of that first terrible week, Magnolia Table was shuttered its windows, taped with police notices, and the kitchen left to rot in the August heat. Her staff drifted away to other jobs or left town entirely haunted by what they could not explain. Her family put up missing posters that wilted in the humidity and peeled off lampposts and sheets. And Savannah learned to speak her name in hushed tones like an old ghost story. For Joanna Griggs had simply walked outside for a breath of air and never returned, leaving behind nothing but questions and an entire town that would never forget the heat of that summer night. The investigation began before dawn the morning after Joanna Griggs vanished from Magnolia Table. Savannah police cruisers parked haphazardly along the narrow street, their headlights cutting through the heavy dawn fog. Officers worked with clipboards and radios in the humid air trying to make sense of the scene. The back alley behind the restaurant was cordoned off with yellow tape, but there was little to see beyond trash bins overflowing with the damp cardboard and the sour stink of spoiled vegetables. No blood marked the pavement. No clothing was torn or scattered. The door was unlocked with no sign of forced entry. Police took photos of everything anyway, noting the cracked concrete, the rusted hinges on the back door, and the dented dumpster that smelled of ammonia and decay. They collected cigarette butts, coffee lids, and scraps of receipt paper, all bagged and tagged as evidence, despite the certainty most of it was just litter from the surrounding bars. Inside the restaurant, the air was stifling with old fryer grease and the bitter char of burnt roux. The detectives moved through the narrow kitchen, examining the plates that had never left the pass, the pots crusted with dried sauce, and the half-prepped ingredients wilting on the stainless counters. Flies buzzed in the warm gloom, attracted by the sugar and cream left out for coffee service. The dish pit was a chaos of plates and cutlery clattering as officers picked through it, searching for anything that seemed out of place. They found Joanna's knife roll neatly stowed on a shelf, her name embroidered in green script. Her spare apron was crumpled near the sink, but it was clean. The chef's office was a broom closet with a ledger of bookings and receipts dated and initialed. Nothing suggested she had planned to leave her business behind. The sous chef, Ben, was brought to the small brick station house downtown for questioning. He sat slumped at the metal table, running his hand through his hair slick with sweat from the long night. He insisted he had no idea where Joanna went. He said she was tense before service, snapping at staff, but that was not unusual on a big night. He told them she had stepped outside for air after taking a phone call and never returned. When asked about the call, he admitted he could not hear the words, but saw her silhouette against the streetlights pacing back and forth as she spoke. He added that she had told him to lock the freezer when she got back, but no one remembered doing it. Officers asked if he had any reason to hurt Joanna, and Ben's voice cracked as he swore he would never. He said she was his mentor, his ticket to better kitchens, and more respect than he had ever earned before. They released him after hours of questioning with no charges. He walked home past the live oaks heavy with Spanish moss, watching the city come to life in the thick heat of morning commuters and dog walkers giving him side-eye. Staff interviews continued all day. The dishwasher recounted how Joanna seemed off-pacing, muttering to herself about invoices and unpaid bills. A server said she had looked at her phone and gone pale before excusing herself. A busboy claimed he heard her crying in the walk-in earlier but was too afraid to ask why. None of these details resolved anything. Police checked her car only to find it parked exactly where it should be in the staff lot behind the restaurant with her keys missing. There were no signs of forced entry, no blood on the seats, no suspicious fingerprints. It was simply there, an inert witness that refused to talk. Meanwhile, Joanna's husband Mike was a study in contradictions. He paced their small house in sweatpants, hair askew, eyes bloodshot from sleeplessness. He told detectives that they had fought the day before about bills and her stubbornness about the restaurant, but insisted she would never leave him or their life without saying something first. He wept in the living room under the stare of Joanna's framed diploma from the Culinary Institute of America. He allowed them to search the house, including her small home office, which held invoices, contractor estimates, and a stack of glossy food magazines. Detectives noted tension in his voice when they asked about money. Mike owed back payments on a boat loan and had a maxed-out credit card but denied any gambling problem. He said Joanna managed the finances. He shrugged when they asked if she might have been hiding anything. On the second day, they brought in dogs trained to track human scent. They sniffed Joanna's clothes pulled from the laundry hamper and led their handlers in circles around the property before stopping in confusion at the alley where she had last been seen. The dogs turned in loops, whining, but failed to fix on any clear direction. Officers scoured the nearby blocks, questioning late-night cooks and bartenders who said they saw nothing unusual beyond the normal arguments and drunk patrons. A dumpster was emptied in front of them, revealing nothing but rotted lettuce and broken bottles. The riverbank was combed again. A diver went in despite the murky brown water swirling with summer algae, but emerged empty-handed and shivering. The case notes, filled with times and places and contradictory witness reports, but no body, no weapon, no answers. The police chief held a press conference on the courthouse steps. Cameras flashed as he read a statement, asking the public for help, reminding viewers that Joanna Griggs was a respected business owner, and that any information, however small, could prove vital. Reporters asked about suspects, and he said they had none. They pressed about whether the husband was cooperating, and the chief hesitated, then said yes. In living rooms across Savannah, families watched the footage while the evening news anchor shook his head solemnly before cutting to weather reports about incoming thunderstorms. Some viewers clucked their tongues in sympathy. Others turned away to finish dinner. But the seed of unease had been planted. As weeks turned into months, the Griggs family home became a monument to silence and unease. Joanna's sister Linda moved back to Savannah from Atlanta, determined to help find answers. She found the house cluttered with unwashed dishes and stacks of mail. Mike drifted from room to room with hollow eyes, ignoring the calls from friends who stopped trying to visit. Linda spent hours in Joanna's small office, sifting through paperwork that smelled faintly of her perfume. She found old recipes scrawled on sticky notes alongside invoices and supplier receipts. She also found a letter addressed to no one in particular, folded and hidden behind a tax folder. The handwriting was Joanna's, and it read like a confession without details, admitting she was tired and considering leaving everything behind. Linda sat on the floor reading it over and over, her tears dropping onto the paper, blurring the ink. She refused to believe Joanna would abandon her own restaurant without saying goodbye to anyone. One afternoon, Linda confronted Mike in the living room where he sat staring at a muted television. She held up the letter demanding to know if he had seen it before. He blinked slowly, his face slack with exhaustion, and said he had no idea what it was. He insisted that Joanna had been under too much pressure and that everyone cracked sometimes. His voice trembled with anger when Linda pressed him about money. He finally snapped and told her the restaurant was drowning in debt, with bills coming due faster than Joanna could pay them. He said they had fought about it for months. He admitted he had suggested they sell Magnolia Table to get out from under the mess. Linda felt sick listening to him and spat back that Joanna would never sell her dream to anyone. Mike turned away, muttering that maybe that was the problem all along. Linda stayed in the guest room, which still smelled faintly of fresh paint from Joanna's attempt to redecorate it. She spent her nights reading through more papers, including bank statements that revealed overdrafts and credit card cash advances. The restaurant account had strange withdrawals, including a $500 cash pull the day before Joanna vanished. The note in the ledger was in Joanna's careful handwriting, but she had not told anyone what it was for. Linda visited the bank in person, demanding answers only to be told privacy laws prevented them from discussing Joanna's accounts without a court order. She left furious and humiliated, standing on the sidewalk watching people stroll past with grocery bags and coffee cups as if nothing had changed in their world. At the same time, detectives continued to dig into the Griggs marriage. They learned from Joanna's closest friends that she had confided about feeling trapped. She had mentioned Mike's sudden mood swings and his drinking, which had increased after his real estate commissions dropped. Friends remembered a bruise on her wrist she brushed off as a kitchen accident. Linda was furious at herself for dismissing it too at the time. She replayed every conversation with Joanna in her head, searching for signs she missed. She remembered Joanna's brittle laugh during their last phone call and the way she changed the subject quickly when asked about Mike. She now realized how carefully Joanna had constructed her excuses and how ready everyone had been to believe them. Detectives quietly questioned Mike again at the station. He sat slumped in the same metal chair, and this time he was less patient. They asked about the $500, and he snapped that he had no idea about her bookkeeping. When they pressed about any fights, he closed his eyes and sighed heavily before admitting they argued about selling the restaurant. He said he wanted out from under the debt and she refused to budge. He denied any physical fights, though his voice cracked when they asked if he had ever threatened her. He shook his head furiously, saying he loved her too much to hurt her. The detectives took notes silently, their pens scratching over the paper in the tense quiet. Linda continued to push in her own way. She called Joanna's suppliers, pretending to be her sister handling affairs. A produce vendor admitted she was behind on payments, but always called to promise she would catch up. A seafood supplier was less kind, muttering about chefs who thought charm could replace checks. Each conversation painted the same picture of a woman stretched thin and fighting to keep her reputation intact. Linda sat at Joanna's old kitchen table with these notes spread out in front of her. The light through the window highlighted dust motes in the stale air. She put her head in her hands and cried until she could not any more. One evening, Linda found herself at Magnolia Table itself, staring through the grimy windows at the empty dining room. The chairs were stacked on the tables and the bar was littered with dusty glassware. The space smelled of mildew and old smoke. She remembered Joanna polishing that bar with obsessive care, running her hand over the wood with pride. She tried to picture her sister walking away from all of it willingly and found she simply could not. She turned back to the street, blinking back tears as a bus rumbled past, and the wind off the river carried the smell of brine and diesel. Meanwhile, the city moved on in its slow southern way. New restaurants opened. Tourists returned to snap photos of historic squares. But among locals, the story of Joanna Griggs remained a dark stain. Her photo on faded missing posters watched from telephone poles and bulletin boards at grocery stores. The police quietly marked the file as cold. Detectives were reassigned. The media stopped asking questions. Linda refused to let it go. She told anyone who would listen that Joanna had secrets, but they did not point to a woman running away. They pointed to someone who had been afraid. She gathered every scrap of paper, every rumor, every half-remembered story, determined to keep her sister alive in memory, if not in body. Linda spent her days sorting Joanna's belongings that had sat undisturbed for months, collecting dust. She opened boxes filled with photo albums that smelled of old paper and glue. The pages stuck slightly in the humid Savannah air as she flipped through them. Each photo was a frozen moment of Joanna's life preserved in bright smiles and candle-lit tables. There were images of her in the kitchen, stirring pots with a focused look on her face while staff watched her with admiration. Linda lingered over these pictures, feeling both love and anger that they now seemed like relics of a ghost. She took careful notes in a lined notebook documenting dates and faces. She was not ready to let these memories slip away into vague nostalgia. She was determined to find something that explained why Joanna was gone. One afternoon, as the cicadas droned outside, Linda spread the photos over the dining table under the yellow glow of an old lamp. She picked up a glossy print from the night Joanna disappeared, showing the kitchen crowded with staff. The servers smiled for the camera, holding plates high. Joanna was in the background, her face half turned and serious. But behind her stood a man Linda did not recognize. He wore a white chef's coat, but his head was angled down as if he was avoiding the lens. His hair was dark and short, and he seemed to be checking his watch. Linda's heart thumped as she realized no one had ever mentioned a new hire that night. She stared at the photo until her eyes watered, trying to memorize every detail. Linda took the photograph to the police station where the walls were lined with wanted posters and corkboards cluttered with notes. The detective on duty regarded the photo with mild curiosity, but she could tell he was already dismissing her. He squinted at the man in the background and shrugged, saying kitchens were chaotic and staff changed constantly. Linda insisted this was different. She said Joanna never hired anyone without checking references and that she had no record of a new cook on her staff list for that night. The detective sighed and wrote something in his notebook, but made no promises. Linda left the station feeling sick with frustration. She walked through the oppressive heat of the afternoon with the photo clutched in her hand, determined to find someone who remembered that night. She tracked down old staff one by one in cafes and living rooms where they watched their children play on faded rugs. Most squinted at the photograph and shook their heads, saying it had been years, and everything blurred together now. One former server named Carla studied it longer and said she remembered a strange man in the kitchen that night. She could not recall his name, but said he was quiet and did not joke around like the others. She remembered Joanna snapping at him to watch the sauce before turning away to check tickets. That was all Carla could offer. She looked embarrassed to remember so little as Linda thanked her anyway. Linda left with a renewed purpose and a deepening sense of dread that this man had simply melted back into the city unseen. Late one evening, Linda sat cross-legged on her living room floor with photo envelopes scattered around her. She found another picture from a supplier dinner a week before Joanna vanished. She scanned every face in the background but saw no sign of the mystery man. She flipped through stacks of Polaroids and color prints from birthdays and staff training events. None of them showed the man in the white coat. The more she searched, the more convinced she became that he had been there only that one night. Her fingers trembled as she labeled an envelope, "Unknown Cook," and placed the evidence inside. She felt a shiver crawl up her spine despite the heat outside. Determined not to rely on fading memories, Linda visited a local camera shop to enlarge the photograph. The owner ran a machine that hummed in Word before spitting out a larger print with better contrast. They leaned over the counter together, examining the man's features. The owner remarked that the timestamp at the corner of the print seemed off. Linda frowned as he explained that it had been altered or reprinted with a different date. She felt her stomach drop, realizing someone had deliberately tried to obscure when the photo was taken. She left the shop, gripping the new print tight in her hand, her pulse pounding in her ears. She brought the enlarged photo to Joanna's old sous chef Ben, who now worked in a hotel kitchen downtown. He stood in the alley behind the hotel taking a smoke break while Linda confronted him. He squinted at the photo and rubbed his temple, claiming he did not remember the man at all. When she pushed harder, Ben grew defensive, saying the kitchen was chaos and he could barely remember what he cooked that night, let alone every face that passed through. His eyes darted away and he wiped sweat from his brow, avoiding her gaze. Linda left feeling both enraged and certain he knew more than he was saying. That night, Linda spread her notes across Joanna's old bed, where the quilt smelled of faded detergent and thyme. She reread the witness statements, the police reports, and her own scribbled thoughts. She pinned the photograph to the wall with a tack, watching the stranger's face stare back at her in grainy focus. She wondered if Joanna had known this man at all, or if he was simply there for one dark purpose. She could not help imagining the sound of the kitchen that night with its hissing pans and shouted orders, and the slow moment when Joanna realized she was not safe. Linda sat on the edge of the bed listening to the creaks of the old house and vowed she would keep pushing even if it broke her completely. Linda sat in her cramped living room with papers spread around her like a chaotic nest. The photo of the unknown man stared up at her from the coffee table next to the reports she had copied from the police station. She could not shake the feeling that someone on staff had seen more than they admitted. She revisited her list of names, underlined in red pen, each circled with notes on who had been there that night. She called and visited them one by one over the next week, pressing harder than before. Some grew impatient, telling her they had families now and could not keep reliving the past. Others turned somber and quiet, as if the memory left a bad taste they would rather spit out than discuss. A former busboy named Anthony sat with her on his porch, tapping his foot nervously. He said he remembered shouting from the back alley, but claimed it was Savannah after dark and everyone shouted eventually. He squinted at the photo but shook his head, saying kitchens hired weirdos all the time. But as Linda packed her things to leave, Anthony hesitated, glancing back at his small house with its peeling paint. He spoke again, voice low and uncertain. He said he thought he remembered Joanna arguing with someone in the alley. He insisted it was not Mike because he had seen her husband arrive much later that night looking panicked. He also said it was not Ben because the sous chef had been yelling at him about dishes inside the whole time. Linda felt her heart hammering as she asked if he could describe the man. Anthony shook his head with frustration, saying it was too dark and he had been scared. He remembered hearing Joanna say something sharp like, "Get away from me," but the rest was swallowed by the hum of the city. He refused to say more, even as she pressed him until she finally left feeling both angry and shaken. Linda went next to Carla, the server who had recalled the strange man before. Carla worked at a new bistro now, balancing orders on her notepad with professional ease. She sat across from Linda in a break room lined with dented lockers and old posters advertising local bands. Carla listened to Linda's questions with wary patience. She said she remembered Joanna seeming angrier than usual that night, distracted and on edge. She also remembered seeing the unknown man once leaning over the prep counter with a sullen look, ignoring everyone around him. But when Linda asked if she remembered hearing any argument, Carla hesitated. She said she thought she heard Joanna's voice rise once from the alley, but could not make out words. She felt sure it was not Mike, but could not say who it was. She admitted she had been too busy and too scared to go check. Linda pressed further, asking if Carla thought Ben might have lied to the police about not recognizing the man. Carla's face tightened as she considered the question. She said Ben had been acting strange for days after Joanna vanished, showing up at her apartment once drunk and rambling about things going wrong and how he had not meant for anything to happen. He would not explain, and when she pushed, he left in a rage. Linda scribbled notes furiously as Carla recounted this shamefaced. Carla admitted she had never told the police about that visit because she felt threatened and just wanted to move on. She wiped her eyes and cursed softly before leaving the room to clock back in. Determined to confront Ben again, Linda waited outside the hotel kitchen where he now worked. She caught him between shifts, leaning against a brick wall, smoking with tired resignation. She held up the photograph and repeated the old questions. Ben stared at it with bloodshot eyes, saying he had told her everything already. When Linda brought up Carla's story about him visiting drunk, he looked away, cheeks flushed. He muttered that he was scared back then and did not want to be blamed for something he did not do. Linda demanded to know why he had not told police about the man in the photo. Ben finally said he remembered the guy showing up asking for work, but claimed Joanna let him in herself. He said he never even got the man's name before that night exploded. He cursed and threw his cigarette away, pacing back and forth with hands on his head. Linda wrote down every word, repeating them back to Ben until he groaned in frustration and told her to leave. She walked away, feeling the heat pressing down on her shoulders like punishment. She realized Ben was protecting himself more than anyone else, hiding the truth to avoid being tied to Joanna's disappearance. Linda felt sick, knowing the police had given up on pushing him. She wondered if they had simply tired of the messy human contradictions everyone offered. She returned home and laid her notes across the table, highlighting every conflicting detail. Anthony heard yelling and a threat. Carla saw the man but heard only fear. Ben admitted the man was real, but pretended not to know more. The stories twisted around each other like old vines, strangling any hope of clarity. As night fell over Savannah, Linda sat by the open window listening to insects drone in the humid dark. She tried to imagine Joanna in that alley, cornered by someone she did not know or did not expect to see. She thought of her sister's proud posture in the kitchen, barking orders, and the way her voice could drop to a cutting whisper when she felt threatened. Linda wondered how long Joanna had been afraid. She realized the investigation had failed, not because the evidence was gone, but because no one wanted to keep looking. Everyone who knew her that night had a reason to forget. They had families, jobs, reputations to protect. Joanna's life had become an inconvenience for everyone but Linda. Linda returned to Magnolia Table on a hot afternoon when the sun lit the old bricks with a tired glow. The building had been closed for years, its windows filmed with grime and streaked by summer rains. A for lease sign hung crookedly in the front window, its letters faded and peeling. Linda paused on the cracked sidewalk, listening to the hum of traffic behind her. She rested her palm against the glass, feeling the heat trapped inside. She could almost hear the echo of her sister's voice shouting orders over clattering pans. She felt a heaviness in her chest, pressing so hard she had to look away. The city around her had changed. New cafes and boutiques lined the block, but Magnolia Table stood as a stubborn ruin, a monument to unanswered questions. She found the property manager's office in a strip mall across town. He was an older man with nicotine-stained fingers who barely looked up from his desk when she explained who she was. He frowned when she asked to see the restaurant. He pulled a ring of keys from a drawer with a sigh, explaining that no one had rented the place in years because it smelled of mildew and old grease. Linda gripped the keys in her hand, feeling their cold bite. She thanked him quietly and left the office, determined to see for herself what remained behind those locked doors. She knew the police had searched it, but she wanted to see it through her own eyes without their hurry and dismissiveness. The next morning she let herself in. The door creaked in protest and the smell hit her immediately. Stale air mixed with rotting wood and something else harder to define. She coughed and pulled her shirt over her nose. Light filtered through the front windows in dusty beams, revealing overturned chairs and a bar sticky with grime. She walked slowly along the floorboards, listening to them creak under her weight. In the dining room, abandoned salt shakers sat like tiny tombstones on forgotten tables. The walls that once displayed local art now showed peeled paint and water stains. She paused by the bar, running her hand over the warped wood, remembering how Joanna had sanded it herself until it shone like honey. In the kitchen, the air was heavier. Pots still hung from their hooks, dust-covered and silent. The stainless steel counters were streaked with brown grime, and rat droppings littered the floor. Linda stepped carefully, trying to ignore the buzzing flies. She approached the old walk-in freezer at the back of the room. Its door stood ajar, the gasket split from years of heat and neglect. She ran her hand along the handle, remembering the police photos of it propped open with no sign of a struggle. She swallowed hard and stepped inside. The walls were lined with the rusted racks. Empty plastic crates lay scattered on the floor. She closed her eyes and tried to imagine her sister standing there on that last day checking inventory or barking at someone to close it properly. Turning to leave, she noticed something odd behind the freezer. A patch of wall looked newer than the rest of the place. She squinted, stepping closer and brushing away cobwebs. The bricks had a different color, and the mortar was cleaner. Her pulse quickened as she traced the lines with her fingers. She pushed gently and felt a subtle give. The wall was not solid but hollow. She stepped back and stared at it, thinking of bootlegging stories her grandfather used to tell about hidden compartments in old Savannah buildings. She felt dizzy with a sick realization. No one had ever mentioned searching this specific wall. The police had taken pictures of the obvious spots and left without checking for anything hidden. Linda retrieved the keys from her pocket and used one to pry at the mortar. Flakes of it fell to the floor as she worked. Finally, a brick came loose, revealing a narrow, dark space behind. The smell that wafted out made her gag. She shone her phone's flashlight into the gap. Inside, she saw old rags matted with something dark and crusted. She reached with trembling fingers and pulled at the edge until something fell out onto the floor. It was a scrap of white fabric. She held it up with shaking hands and saw the faint green stitching of Joanna's name. The cloth was stiff with what looked like old blood dried into ugly, rust-colored blotches. Linda let out a ragged breath that turned into a sob. She stumbled back and sat hard on the floor staring at the fabric. She felt cold despite the stifling heat. Her mind raced with the memory of Joanna's carefully kept aprons all ironed and clean. This one had been hidden away as if someone needed to forget it existed. She imagined the scene over and over, her sister forced against the freezer wall. Her voice low and sharp telling someone to leave her alone, the man in the photo standing too close, the staff too busy to notice. And then silence. She pressed the cloth to her chest, rocking slightly as her tears fell onto the dirty tiles. Eventually, she rose unsteadily, wiping her face with her sleeve. She took photos of the hidden space and the stained fabric. She placed the scrap in a plastic bag she had brought for trash collecting but now used to preserve this awful relic. She stepped out of the kitchen into the dining room, feeling the light on her face like an accusation. She left the building, locking the door behind her. She stood on the sidewalk, breathing hard as cars rolled by, indifferent to the revelation that had just changed everything. She called the police with trembling fingers, forcing herself to sound calm. She demanded they come immediately. When the officers arrived, they treated the scene with new gravity. They took her statement with slow, measured words. They photographed the hidden compartment and collected the stained apron carefully. Linda watched them work, arms crossed tight over her chest. She did not bother to hide her fury when they apologized for missing it all those years ago. She barely spoke as they sealed the door and promised to analyze the evidence. She walked home in the late afternoon light feeling wrung out and hollow. She passed neighbors watering lawns and waving without seeing them. In her pocket, the plastic bag rustled faintly like a guilty whisper. The police reopened their files with the grim evidence in hand, but Linda was already thinking 2 steps ahead. She spent sleepless nights at her kitchen table with documents spread out in messy piles. She highlighted notes and circled names, remembering every rumor she had heard in the months after Joanna disappeared. One name kept resurfacing among hushed voices in the restaurant scene. Ray Delgado had been Joanna's biggest competition in Savannah, known for his swagger and his aggressive approach to business. His bistro had always lagged behind Magnolia Table in reviews, but after Joanna vanished, he claimed her regular suppliers and customers almost overnight. Linda recalled that shift with sharp clarity and resentment. She knew success could be cutthroat, but it had never sat right with her how quickly Ray capitalized on her sister's absence. Determined to confront him, she tracked Ray to his new restaurant on the riverfront. It was all polished floors and Edison bulbs with a long bar lined with expensive bourbon. Linda stood at the entrance watching diners laugh over their drinks while Ray held court behind the bar in his crisp white shirt. She waited until the crowd thinned before stepping forward to meet his gaze. He gave her a tight smile that did not reach his eyes as she introduced herself. She saw a flicker of annoyance cross his face before he wiped it away with professional charm. They sat at a corner table where she pulled out a copy of the photo with the mystery man in the kitchen. She laid it on the table between them, watching his reaction carefully. Ray glanced at the photo, but his face remained unreadable. He leaned back and asked why she was bothering him after so many years. Linda explained in measured words what she had found behind the freezer wall at Magnolia Table and how the police had reopened the case. She watched his fingers drum against the table, then stopped suddenly as she mentioned the blood-stained apron. He looked away toward the bar, as if considering how to answer. Finally, he claimed he had no idea who the man was and no connection to anything that happened that night. His voice was calm, but Linda noticed the muscle in his jaw twitch. She pressed him harder, bringing up how quickly he had bought out her sister's wine contracts and negotiated his supplier deals after Joanna was declared missing. Ray bristled at that accusation. He told her it was business, and someone had to step in when Magnolia Table went dark. He said suppliers needed new customers, and he had the money ready. His tone grew harder as he told her she was grasping at straws and had no right to blame him for what happened to Joanna. Linda refused to back down. She asked if he had ever offered to buy Magnolia Table before Joanna disappeared. Ray fell silent. She watched him struggle for words before admitting he had made an offer once. He described a meeting with Joanna at the restaurant and 2 weeks before she vanished, where he tried to convince her to sell. She turned him down flat, saying she would never sell her dream to someone who wanted to gut it for profit. He smirked bitterly as he recalled her words. Linda sat forward, seizing on this admission. She asked if they had argued. Ray snorted and said of course they had. He was not the type to mince words, and Joanna was proud to a fault. He insisted he left that meeting angry, but that was the end of it. He claimed he had not seen her again before she vanished. Linda watched his eyes shift away again as he spoke. She asked why he had never told police about that meeting. Ray said no one had asked, and besides, he did not see why it mattered. He picked up the photo again and tossed it back to her, saying he had enough to worry about without chasing old ghosts. Leaving the restaurant, Linda felt a sickness in her stomach. She walked along the riverfront under strings of lights that cast rippling reflections on the dark water. She could not decide if Ray was lying or if he truly believed he had no connection to Joanna's fate. She thought about his anger in that meeting and the way he had described her refusal with grudging respect. She could almost hear her sister's voice calling him a hack to his face while refusing his money. That image brought her no comfort. She realized Savannah's restaurant world was smaller than people liked to admit. Everyone knew each other's secrets and debts. She could not help wondering if someone like Ray would have paid to make a problem go away, even if he had not gotten his own hands dirty. Back at home, Linda documented every detail of the conversation. She wrote about Ray's shifting expressions, the bitterness in his voice, and his careful omissions. She compared it to what she remembered of Joanna's old supplier invoices, showing rapid changes in accounts right after she went missing. She gathered copies of emails from vendors who had been quick to switch their loyalty and highlighted passages that mentioned Ray by name. The evidence was circumstantial, but it formed a pattern she could not ignore. She realized this was how people got away with things. No single action looked criminal in isolation, but together they formed an ugly truth everyone pretended not to see. Determined not to stop, Linda took her notes to the police the next day. She sat in the stale station waiting room with its flickering fluorescent lights and old coffee smell. She laid out her evidence in front of a detective who looked tired but listened patiently. He frowned as she described Ray's admissions about the failed buyout and his dismissive attitude. The detective asked careful questions, taking notes in a small pad. Linda felt a grim satisfaction as he promised to look into it. She left the station exhausted but slightly lighter, knowing she had forced someone to pay attention to a man who thought he was untouchable. She walked home in the late afternoon sun thinking of Joanna's bright laugh and the way she used to mock chefs who thought they could buy their way to respect. Linda sat in the archives room of the police department with her elbows on a scratched wooden table surrounded by boxes stacked to the low ceiling. The air smelled of dust and old paper, and the buzzing fluorescent lights cast everything in a pale, cold glow. She flipped through one folder after another, searching for anything the original investigators might have missed. She felt her eyes burn with fatigue, but refused to stop. Each page offered the same stale narrative about Joanna's stress, her debts, the theory she might have run away. None of it felt real to Linda. She forced herself to read every word slowly and deliberately, refusing to let the officer's dismissive tone win. She thought of her sister standing in the kitchen, proud and stubborn, barking orders. She would never have run. Linda whispered that under her breath like a vow, each time the report suggested otherwise. Her fingers finally stopped on a page marked Witness Interview. The date was from the week after Joanna vanished. Linda read carefully. It described a neighbor behind Magnolia Table who reported hearing a woman scream in the alley on the night Joanna disappeared. The neighbor said the voice was sharp and desperate, but the noise stopped abruptly before she could see anything from her back porch. The report noted that officers canvassed the area but found nothing. The words at the bottom made Linda's stomach twist. It simply read no follow-up planned. She read it again in disbelief, pressing her fingers into the paper until they shook. She could not understand how something so clear had been discarded so easily. She closed her eyes and imagined her sister's voice cracking in fear in the darkness while that neighbor sat frozen behind her curtains listening but too afraid to come out. Linda shoved the box away and stood her legs unsteady. She carried the folder to the duty desk where a young officer looked at her with polite confusion. She demanded to know why this witness had never been re-interviewed. The officer glanced at the old report and shrugged, saying he would note it for the detectives. Linda could see he was already forgetting her the moment she walked away. She left the station gripping the folder with white knuckles, knowing it was one more failure she would have to fix herself. Back home, she spread out the contents on her dining table under the soft glow of a single lamp. She ran her finger over the words, picturing the neighbor alone in her small house, hearing something terrible, and then returning to bed. She felt a rush of anger at the police who had decided it was too much trouble to ask more questions. She decided to find the neighbor herself. She flipped through old property records she had requested from the city office. The houses behind Magnolia Table had changed owners over the years, but one address matched the name on the old report. Linda wrote it down and sat staring at it while the evening cicadas rasped outside her window. She knew it would be another hard conversation, but she had grown used to them. The next day, she walked the few blocks to the house. The porch sagged a little and the paint was peeling. A wind chime rattled in the sticky breeze. Linda knocked twice and waited, listening to the sound of a television inside. The door opened slowly, revealing an older woman with wary eyes and thin lips. Linda introduced herself, explaining in careful words who she was and why she had come. The woman's eyes darted to the floor as she listened. When Linda asked about the scream, the woman flinched visibly. She said she did not want to think about that night. Linda pleaded gently, telling her about the blood-stained apron and the reopened case. Finally, the woman sank onto a porch chair and covered her face with shaking hands. She told Linda she'd heard a voice she recognized as female crying out in terror. It was a single scream that cut off sharply like someone being silenced. She admitted she felt paralyzed listening from the darkness behind her window, afraid to draw attention. She said she stayed there for hours afterward, watching the alley and seeing no one else come or go. Linda asked if she remembered seeing anyone. The woman shook her head, but described hearing hurried footsteps on the pavement soon after. Linda wrote down every word, her heart racing with painful relief that someone finally confirmed her sister had not simply walked away. The woman began crying softly, saying she had wanted to forget it all. Linda squeezed her shoulder gently, promising that it mattered even now. Linda returned home with fresh notes in hand and called the detective in charge of the reopened case. She sat at her kitchen table, listening to the ringtone, feeling the weight of her own pulse in her ears. When he answered, she read her notes line by line. She refused to let him interrupt her until she was finished. The detective sounded more serious this time, promising to send someone to re-interview the neighbor officially. Linda felt no comfort in his voice, but she hung up knowing she had forced the system to acknowledge what they had buried. She leaned back in her chair, exhausted, but grimly satisfied. That night she pulled out old receipts she had copied from Joanna's home office. She noticed for the first time an odd charge dated the day Joanna vanished. It was a fuel purchase on Mike's credit card at a station on the far side of town near the old bridge. Linda remembered Mike insisting he had been home watching the ball game. She circled the charge in red pen over and over, feeling her throat tighten. She wondered how the police had missed that, or if they had simply chosen to believe the easier story. She turned to the page and forced herself to keep reading every line, refusing to let anything slip by again. The weeks after the hidden wall discovery passed in a blur of calls and meetings. The police took the blood-stained apron scrap for testing, and Linda found herself pacing her small living room every night waiting for the phone to ring. When the results came back, she sat across from the detective in a cramped office filled with file boxes and stale coffee smell. He read from his notes in a low voice that seemed to weigh every syllable. The blood on the apron had been matched to Joanna through DNA from a hairbrush Linda provided. The rest of the cloth was so degraded it offered little else, but what they found beneath the dried blood changed everything. Linda felt her stomach twist when the detective paused before saying the words. They found DNA from a second person, a male profile that did not match Mike or any known staff member. Linda sat frozen as the detective folded his hands on the table. She felt her heart beat in her ears as she asked if they knew who it was. He shook his head, explaining it was an unknown sample with no match in the database. He said they would keep looking, but the trail was old and the sample small. Linda pressed her fingers against her forehead, trying to process what it meant. She felt a sick certainty that the man in the photograph, the stranger in the chef's coat, was the one who left that trace behind. She remembered how no one could identify him, how he seemed to appear for one night and vanish. She left the station feeling her knees tremble with equal parts rage and relief. It was proof that Joanna had bled in that restaurant and that someone else had been close enough to leave part of himself behind. That evening, she called Joanna's old sous chef Ben, who had moved apartments twice since the police reopened the case. She sat on her porch with her cell pressed tight to her ear, listening to his voice go quiet as she explained the DNA findings. He sounded shaken, telling her he remembered the man more clearly now. He said Joanna had seemed tense with him, almost warning. Ben's voice cracked as he admitted he heard them arguing about something he could not catch. He had lied before about not noticing anything because he had been scared and because the kitchen was chaos and no one wanted to deal with police after it all fell apart. Linda sat in silence as he talked, staring at the darkening street as porch lights blinked on one by one. She'd scribbled his words in a notebook, pressing so hard the pen tore the page. The next morning, she visited the police again, placing the notebook on the detective's desk. He read it carefully, his brow furrowed deep with new lines. He thanked her with a weariness that told her he was starting to realize how badly they had failed the first time around. He promised to call Ben himself and take a formal statement. Linda nodded but refused to leave. She leaned forward, asking what they were doing about the second DNA profile. The detective sighed and admitted they had no leads. She asked if they had questioned Ray Delgado. The detective said they had and described Ray's lawyered-up responses and refusals to answer anything beyond what he admitted about the buyout offer. Linda listened without blinking. She told the detective to keep pushing because she would not stop asking. Meanwhile, the police returned to Magnolia Table, sealing it off again with fresh tape. Forensics crews spent days combing the space with new equipment and techniques that had not existed a decade earlier. Neighbors watched from porches and sidewalks as officers carried boxes and camera equipment in and out. Linda stood behind the barricade some days with arms crossed, listening to the buzz of cicadas and the low murmur of people speculating. She refused to hide her face from anyone who asked what she was doing there. She told them plainly that her sister had been murdered in that building and that she would stand there every day if it forced people to remember. Some nodded with quiet respect. Others averted their eyes. One afternoon, while the forensic team worked inside, a contractor helping to stabilize a wall found something buried behind a rotted baseboard in the old prep area. It was a crumpled apron with Joanna's name stitched neatly in green along the top hem. Unlike the scrap found earlier, this one was mostly intact, though stained with dark blotches and stiff with age. Linda received the call as she sat at home sorting old bills and nearly dropped the phone when she heard the words. She arrived at the scene shaking so badly she had to lean against her car. She watched as officers bagged the apron, carefully sealing it with evidence tape. She felt her throat close at the sight of that familiar green stitching. At the station, the detective showed her photos of the apron under bright lights. The stains were unmistakable. They said it appeared to have been wadded up and shoved behind the wall as though someone meant to forget it existed. Linda pressed a hand to her mouth, fighting nausea as she recognized the pattern Joanna always favored in her aprons. She asked if they found anything else. The detective said there were hair strands tangled in the fabric which would be tested. He said they would try to get the second DNA profile again from this better-preserved evidence. Linda swallowed hard and asked him to promise he would not let it sit in an evidence locker for another decade. He looked her in the eyes and nodded slowly. That night, she spread her notes across the dining table one more time. She added a new page with the words "second apron" found in careful block letters. She underlined it twice and sat back listening to the creaks of the old house settling around her. She thought of Joanna standing at the prep table tying that apron around her waist. She thought of the blood that had soaked into the fabric. She closed her eyes and let the tears come hot and silent. But when she opened them again, she felt something like steel in her chest. She would not let this moment slip into polite silence the way Savannah liked to bury its uglier truths. Linda sat at her dining table long after the sun had set the street outside quiet, except for the distant hum of traffic and the occasional bark of a dog. She stared at the evidence she had assembled over so many relentless months. The photos of Joanna smiling in her white chef's coat lay beside crime scene images of the blood-stained apron, the hidden wall, and the old police reports with their dismissive notes. She read them all with slow, methodical precision as if willing them to yield new truths. Her pen hovered over the notebook where she wrote questions she still could not answer. Who had Joanna argued with in that alley? Why had that stranger been hired for one night? And who had let him slip away while the city chose to forget? Her jaw tightened as she thought of every moment someone had told her to move on, to let Joanna rest, to leave the past buried. She refused to bury anything. At the station, the detectives reviewed the new evidence with a grim focus Linda had not seen from them before. The DNA tests on the second apron revealed the same unknown male profile alongside Joanna's blood, confirming violent contact in the kitchen. Forensic techs mapped the scene and documented how the wall had been sealed over time. They theorized that whoever killed Joanna had time to hide the evidence while the chaotic service distracted the rest of the staff. Linda listened to these discussions without speaking until the room fell silent. She lifted her chin and told them what she believed. Someone had helped the killer leave unnoticed, or at least kept quiet about it. Someone in that kitchen knew what happened, even if they claimed they had seen nothing. She watched the officers exchange glances, knowing she was right. The detectives began calling old staff for new interviews. They pressed Ben harder than before, forcing him to describe every detail of that night. He admitted he remembered the stranger arriving late with no clear explanation, and said Joanna's expression turned to anger the moment she saw him. Ben's voice cracked as he described hearing muffled shouting from the alley, but said he stayed at the stove refusing to check because he feared her temper and his own failure to manage the line alone. He lowered his head in shame as he told them he had seen Joanna come back in once, briefly, her face pale and lips tight, before she stepped out again for what would be the last time. Linda sat in the corner listening to Ben's confession, feeling rage and pity churn in her chest. She wondered if he ever understood how cowardice could kill as surely as any knife. Police records from the reopened investigation revealed something even more damning. Mike's alibi fell apart under renewed questioning. Investigators confronted him with the fuel purchase on his credit card far from home that night. He initially tried to dismiss it as a mistake, but eventually broke down, admitting he had gone for a drive to calm down after their fight about the restaurant's debts. He said he could not face Joanna's stubbornness anymore, her refusal to sell even as bills piled up. When asked why he never mentioned this before, he covered his face with shaking hands and sobbed that he had been ashamed of leaving her alone. Linda listened to the recording of this confession at the station, her fingers pressing so hard into her chair that her knuckles whitened. She felt no sympathy. She believed every moment he had left her sister alone in that alley was its own small betrayal. Detectives turned their attention to Ray Delgado with new urgency. They found records of texts and calls to a number registered under a kitchen supply business that no longer existed, but linked back to the stranger in the photograph through employment records in another state. This man had worked briefly in restaurants up and down the coast using different variations of his name, but disappeared entirely after 1995. Police confronted Ray with these records in a formal interview. Ray sat stiffly with his lawyer beside him, his face impassive as they laid out the evidence that the man he hired for that single shift had never returned or been seen again in the city. Ray's lawyer spoke over every question, but the detective recorded the long telling silences between interruptions. Linda sat in the waiting area, watching lawyers stride back and forth, wondering how much money it cost to forget a human life. When Ray finally emerged from the room, he avoided Linda's eyes. She stood in his path, forcing him to stop, her voice steady despite the tremble in her knees. She asked him why he thought he deserved her sister's customers, her staff, her contracts, if he ever once thought about the price Joanna paid for refusing to sell. Ray said nothing. He only pushed past her with a hard shoulder and kept walking down the hall while Linda turned slowly to the detective behind her and told him plainly she was not done fighting. The detective nodded without a word, and they both understood the truth. There would be no confession, no signed paper admitting guilt, only the relentless weight of evidence slowly crushing the last denials. The investigation ground forward like an old engine sputtering to life. News spread in Savannah as local papers picked up the story again, this time with headlines about blood evidence and long-ignored witnesses. Reporters interviewed former staff who looked at the camera with haunted eyes, describing that chaotic night, the shouting the stranger no one really knew. Linda watched each broadcast with cold eyes. She heard sympathy in the anchors' voices, but she no longer trusted it. She knew how quickly sympathy faded once the story stopped being fresh. But she kept talking to anyone who would listen. She described Joanna's laugh and her recipes and the nights they sat on the porch, sharing cheap wine while planning a future that would never come. She spoke the words so the city could not pretend not to hear. When the final forensic report came back, it landed on the detective's desk with the dull slap of paper on wood. He called Linda to the station and read it to her line by line. The DNA profile from the second apron matched the same unknown man as the first scrap, consistent with contact during a struggle. The blood pattern suggested blunt force trauma. Joanna had been attacked in her own kitchen, bleeding onto the floor and into the fabric she always wore with pride. Linda listened, without crying, her eyes burning dry and clear. She asked if they could name her killer. The detective exhaled slowly and admitted they could not. The man had vanished, likely dead or living under another name. The city would never see him in handcuffs. Linda closed her eyes and accepted the answer because it was the only truth left. The police released Joanna's remains after excavation at Magnolia Table finally confirmed her body had been hidden behind the old freezer wall all those years. Linda stood in a small funeral home beside a plain wooden casket, her hand resting on its smooth surface. She remembered every fight they ever had, every joke they shared, the way Joanna lit up when describing a perfect dish. She spoke softly to the casket, promising she had not forgotten, would never forget. Family and old friends came and went, leaving flowers and quiet apology for looking away so long. Linda made sure Joanna was buried with one of her aprons cleaned and pressed a green-stitched name bright as new. On the day the restaurant was finally demolished, Linda watched from across the street as the old bricks fell in clouds of dust. She stood straight, arms crossed over her chest, refusing to flinch at the noise. The city was already planning new condos, another clean face over old secrets. But Linda knew she would remember every floorboard, every stubborn nail, every echo of her sister's voice raised in triumph and anger. She understood Savannah liked its stories neat and respectable, but some truths could not be paved over. When asked later why she fought so long, she said it was because Joanna deserved more than silence. She deserved to be seen even in death for the fierce and flawed woman she had been. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more, please take a moment to like and subscribe to the channel. I would love to hear what you think about the plot and where you are watching from, so be sure to share your thoughts in the comments. Your feedback helps keep these stories coming.